Okay. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to a very special session where we will hear about the homelessness crisis in our community and the ways that we are working to find solutions. We will hear from Amanda Delgado, who joins us from the Illumination Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to providing targeted services to end the cycle of homelessness in Southern California. We will then hear from LA Deputy City Attorney Mike Heinrichs, who will share how the city's tiny house project is helping move us toward a solution to this crisis. Both speakers will help provide perspective and insight for this year's spring project. Before I turn it over to Amanda, I just want to remind all of you that if you have a question at any point during today's session, please post them to the chat box. Kent Cowan will monitor the chat box and will interject with questions when appropriate. Also, please feel free to take notes throughout the session because there's going to be a lot of great information. So without further delay, Amanda, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me. Let me share my screen. Let's make sure I do this right. Share computer sound. Okay. Let's see. Can we see my PowerPoint?
I can see it. Looks great.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you again. My name is Amanda Delgado, and I am the Associate Manager of Marketing and Community Engagement at Illumination Foundation. I've been with this nonprofit for coming up on 3 years now, and I started as a volunteer coordinator. I'm very passionate about, volunteering and community engagement, and now I sort of focus more on our social media and more fundraising events when we can have fundraising events again. So let me jump in and get started. We're just going to discuss a little bit of the history and the programs that we have and who we serve. So this is our origin story. This is how it all started. This photo here is of the Fullerton Armory back in 2007. If you look really closely, you might be able to see quite a few kids in this photo. The reason I bring that up is because our CEO and founder of Illumination Foundation, Paul Leon, at this time was a public health nurse. So he was scheduled to come meet a client here, to do case management one-on-one and just healthcare. And when he got there, he was just shocked by, the amount of people that he saw, but mostly the amount of kids that he saw. And that kind of sparked a little light in him to tackle the issues of homelessness in Orange County. And that's kind of how Illumination started, and we've been around for over a decade. So what is homelessness? A lot of us define it as, those that are living on the streets or in a shelter, a garage, or even in a car. But one of the facts that I find most interesting that is defined as homelessness is multiple families doubled up in a one-bedroom apartment. And in my past job, a lot of the students that I worked with, mostly elementary age kids, were living in this situation. And at the time, myself and the kids, we did not define this as homelessness because we think, you have a roof over your head, you're not homeless. But in this case, it's basically a non-permanent situation to housing. So when you have multiple families living under one roof, not everyone has their own bedroom, and you might have, a mom sleeping on the floor and a child sleeping on a couch. So we see that a lot in, the families that we serve. And we focus on 2 different types of homelessness. So intergenerational homelessness describes how children are born into families that are experiencing housing instability, which is the, in the past slide, what I was talking about. And with that, there's a lot of early development delays and trauma that they're experiencing as a child. So in this case, our Children and Families program really tries to tackle this head on so that the children in our program aren't, moving on in life, experiencing homelessness, and then, when they have kids, eventually they're able to provide basic needs. So when we say we try to break the cycle of homelessness, that's what we're trying to break. And then on the other hand is chronic homelessness. This is a lot of our single adults that we find a lot in our shelters. So, homelessness is just a way of life. They're stuck in the cycle of poverty. They're homeless, continuously 1 year or more at a time. So those are the two different aspects that we're seeing of homelessness. So why disrupt the cycle of homelessness? Well, we believe at Illumination Foundation that every person has an intrinsic right to home, health, and dignity. And we focus on everything, not just homeless or not just housing, but everything else that one might face, some type of barrier that they might face into gaining housing. So as you can imagine, in 2020, it was, the pandemic hit, and a lot of us were worried about all of the homeless that are on the streets and how COVID would affect them. So in 2020, we served over 5,000 clients, providing them shelter, healthcare, counseling, social services, any type of service that one might need to get to self-sufficiency again. And with COVID-19, the county was able to provide us with 6 sites that we can house those that are on the streets. We served, over 2,000 of those clients during all of last year during COVID. And a lot of those clients did experience COVID symptoms. So we had a lot of team members that were on site just to make sure that everyone was safe and healthy. And with that, we were able to open up 2 new facilities, one in Fullerton. This is a navigation center and recuperative care. So it kind of merges 2 of our services together. So one side of it is a shelter, the other side of it is a recuperative care. And what a recuperative care is, which I'll explain in a little bit, but it's homeless patients that have been discharged from the hospital. They're able to stay with us and recover under our care, and then eventually find housing for them. And then the other facility that we opened is the Gilbert Family Emergency Shelter, which is our 3rd family emergency shelter located in Anaheim, where each room of the house will hold a family, which is really nice because everyone can stay together and they are able to receive all the services that we offer everyone. So I like this graphic because it kind of shows the process of everything. So street, we see, families, individuals that are on the street and homeless, and the next step to that is placing them in emergency shelter. And at this stage, this is where our case managers are available to really help, get them back on their feet and figure out what they need to do to get back on their feet. And with that becomes bridge housing, which is a unique situation because at this stage we have facilities that we can, it's like a micro community. So what that is different homes that we have where, individual adults or families can kind of stay together like our emergency shelter, but at this point they're helping pay a portion of the rent. So at this point they're getting back on their feet, they have financial stability, they're, working on, job stability, training, behavioral health, mental health is a big aspect. So this is kind of their transition period, bridge housing and micro community. And then the main goal is to get them to permanent housing. So this here is a couple pictures of our families for our children and families program. I love this program so much. Like I mentioned, the intergenerational homelessness, I think it's so important to tackle the issues of homelessness at such a young age. A lot of the children that we see are experiencing a lot of trauma. So in our program, we have behavioral health therapists that will come and do one-on-one counseling with them, group counseling, parent and me classes, which are amazing. Right now, they've been doing virtual tutoring. So we have a couple volunteers that will support um, virtually with children that need help with their homework. So that's a big part of it too, is we don't want children to fall behind in their schooling either. So we're definitely working with the children to make sure that they have the confidence that they need to, you know, be self-sufficient with their families as well. And then our navigation centers, which is what I kind of talked about earlier. It's a 24-hour facility. They don't have to leave. Like the Fullerton Armory that I showed the first picture, those clients had to leave at a certain time of the day, get back in line just to have another spot in the shelter again, so that they feel safe. And that can cause a lot of anxiety for people because, you know, if you have to leave for some reason, you might not get your place in line, might not get a bed that night. So what's so nice about our shelters is, you know, you can come and go. We have clients that will go to work and come back. So definitely you can come and go, and we have transportation available to those that need it, and just a lot of services that are offered out of here. Like I mentioned, we have case managers on site, behavioral health on site. They have access to computers, so if they want to look up jobs, they can. It's kind of dorm style, so you know, men are one side, women are on the other. They all have their own space, but they all share common areas. So the picture on the top right, you can see there's a lot of tables there and a TV, so everyone can kind of sit, eat together. So there's a lot of community involved in our shelters and navigation centers. Recuperative care, like I mentioned before, this is probably one of our largest programs that we have. We have 6 recuperative care centers. And like I mentioned, this is a place for homeless patients that were at the hospital. They get to come and recuperate and recover under our care versus, you know, going back on the streets when they're being discharged. And typically when that happens, they wind back up into the hospital again. So with recuperative care, they are able to get the same services, as I mentioned, behavioral health, case management, but what's unique is they get that medical care attention. So there's a lot of medical education around here to help, you know, our clients understand what they have. You know, sometimes I'll go to the doctor and my doctor's explaining stuff and I don't know what they're saying. So half the time. So this is nice that we have, you know, nursing students and nurses on site, and our medical care coordinators on site to just kind of explain, you know, what their condition is and how, you know, when to take your medication. They'll distribute their medications when they need to, and just make sure that, you know, they're in a safe and healthy environment. And what's really cool is if you, that bottom right picture, you see a little puppy there. We allow dogs at some of our sites, which is really nice because a lot of the times we will have clients that will refuse any help if they can't bring their puppy. You know, I wouldn't want to go anywhere without my puppy either. So I think that's a big part of the healing process as well as having your pet. We've even had, I think, a pet turtle at one point too, which was interesting. So that's super nice that we have that there for them. And then counseling service is a big part of our recuperative care. There's substance abuse programs that we offer, transportation to their doctors. So yeah, all the same services as our other sites. Just the only difference is they get medical attention. Let's see if my video, okay, so I'm gonna share this video. This is a client from one of our recuperative care centers. It's just a really inspirational story about how, you know, homelessness can just impact your life so quickly, and things in your life can change so quickly, and then just her journey in getting back on her feet again. So I'm gonna share this.
My name is Tara Lachelle Stover. I'm 38 years old and I'm from the moon, baby. No, I'm just kidding. I'm from California. Things that I'm passionate about definitely would be contributing to the greater good of mankind.
Tara came to Illumination Foundation as one of our clients who was experiencing homelessness and also was living out of her car.
So I started experiencing homelessness, I would say a few years ago, about 3 years ago. I have 5 different rare eye diseases in my left eye, and part of that I have visual distortions. One night I was in the restroom and saw what looked to be a crack in the floor, took a misstep, fell, hit my head, had a traumatic brain injury. At the time I was a server, a waitress, bartender, and I just started messing up, couldn't remember taking orders. Shifts became less, started to dive into savings, and I can't remember too much of that time, but just I couldn't keep up with bills, and next thing I know, I'm in my car.
So as all our clients come in here, my job is first to approach them, introduce myself, and offer my services, and Tara was really receptive to that. Tara, to me, has a warrior spirit. She is very intelligent, very polite in how she speaks, very respectful, and she is very vulnerable, strong, but yet vulnerable.
People think you're homeless because you're a prostitute or you're into drugs or this or that, and it isn't what it appears to be. And I'm grateful that I've been given this opportunity with the foundation to have myself back.
I think the most important thing that really impresses me about Tara is her willingness to try something different. Her willingness to analyze her own self and being open to hearing how else can she improve her life. And I think that was the most beautiful thing, just her willingness to try something different. And I think that's why I call her the warrior spirit.
Yeah, so what home means to me this season especially would be peace, quiet, calm. Things as simple as having an actual restroom to use the bathroom in, hot water, a bed, laughter, laughter definitely, warm blankets, clean sheets, and just reintroducing myself to myself, really. That's what home looks like for me this season.
So I love sharing stories like that, just because we have so many clients that come through and they all have a different story. They all end up, you know, being impacted by homelessness or different things that affect them in many different ways. So I think Tara's story was probably one that really made a big impact on a lot of people too, just seeing, you know, where she was and where she is now is just completely turned around. So it's really inspirational. The last type of housing that I want to share is micro communities, which I briefly touched on. We have 21 micro communities, and they're all, large homes, as you can see in some of the pictures, where, different adults can come together and, live in different rooms, but they all split the rent together. So this is part of that micro community bridge housing that I touched on earlier. Volunteering. I miss having volunteers and doing all of that stuff. So right now, everything is virtual and some type of donation drive, but I just wanted to share this with everyone just to see things that we've been doing and how we've had to change the way we, share ways to get involved during COVID. So a lot of it has been goodie bags for clients, appreciation goodie bags for staff. Our staff that work at all the centers that I shared are considered frontline workers because, they've been nonstop since the beginning and they've had to do so much and they've taken care of so many people. So we've been doing that and just a lot of stuff to kind of uplift and keep our clients busy. At the beginning, like March, April of last year, all of our clients were on lockdown. We didn't want them to go anywhere because we just weren't sure about what was going on. So we wanted to keep them safe and healthy. So a lot of our donors and volunteers would send in activity boxes for them. So like word searches and all that stuff, just to keep our clients busy. And that's the end of my presentation. That's my email if anyone wants to jot it down. If you have any questions later that you haven't thought of, then that's our website. And then follow us on social media. Our handle is If Homeless, and we are on Facebook and Instagram. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them to the best of my ability. But I'm pretty much, I'll stop sharing.
We did have one from Ruby, from one of our student, and about sort of how the foundation service clients with mental health issues. I know you touch upon them a little bit here and there, but can you explain to the students a little bit more on sort of what that process is like? Is it an ongoing check-in with the clients, sort of a little bit more on the details of it?
Yeah, so mental health and behavioral health, pretty much all of our services, so everyone has a case manager that they can connect with, and the case manager will assess what their needs are. So if it is behavioral health, if they're noticing that they might need some counseling services, they'll set that up, and we have our own behavioral health therapist that will sit and do one-on-one or group with them. And they'll basically, all of our services are available to everyone, even if they've already been housed permanently. We'll stay with them and provide the services until they tell us we're good, we don't need it anymore. So it's kind of a case-by-case basis. Everyone's different. That was a good question.
Let's see. Another questions from Amelia about for clients with dogs, and you mentioned that some facilities, are dogs friendly. What in the facilities? What is it that how do you guys make it more comfortable for them, to bring their pets with them?
So we, so for example, at our La Mesa shelter that's in Anaheim, we have a dog run that's outside of the center. So we have kennels for each pet, which is nice because then it gives, I use myself as an example because I'm a dog mom. So if I was in their shoes, all I would care about is my pet. I would probably, that's why I said the example that clients would refuse service if they care so much about their dog and they don't want to give them up. So we want to make sure that, you know, the pets are safe, but they also feel comfortable with leaving their pets. So the kennels are available if they have to go to work, or they have, you know, an appointment with a behavioral health counselor, or they need to meet their case manager. We have those available to them so they have peace of mind that their pet is okay. But, you know, the dogs are able to sleep next to them, so they can come into the dorms with them, as long as, you know, the dog is on good behavior too. But most of the time the dogs are pretty well behaved, and we have every single type of dog imaginable. So yeah, we want to make sure everyone is comfortable.
Then another question from Maximus. In terms of the program itself, do you guys have any metrics on your successes in the program, and how, you know, how has your client come out on the other end?
I know we have metrics and numbers. I'm not the best in remembering those numbers, but if that is something that you guys want, I would be happy to ask our data team and get those numbers for you. But, you know, every client is different, every case is different, every program is different. So I know we have different numbers for each program and service that we offer.
Great, thanks, Amanda. I see a couple more, so I'm gonna hold it off for towards later towards the end of our session. So I'll give it back to you, Anne.
All right, thank you. And thank you so much, Amanda, for the great work the Illumination Foundation is doing. And you've given us great insight into your foundation, everything it's doing for the homelessness issue. It's very inspiring. So now I would like to invite Mike Heinrichs to speak about how Los Angeles is working toward a solution to the crisis. Mike?
Thanks, Anne. Hi, everyone. So as Anne mentioned, I'm actually a deputy city attorney at the city of LA, but the reason I get involved with some of the housing projects is because several years back, voters in the city of LA passed something called Proposition HHH, which was basically an increase to property taxes that would allow basically the county and the city to fund issuing bonds, basically money that we can raise in the, you know, the markets, in order to issue loans to people to build affordable housing projects. So, you know, I see a lot of the day-to-day stuff in construction, but I'm probably not the best person in terms of, you know, going through details on some of the specific sites that we're going to look at. But I'm happy to, you know, answer questions where I can. So let's see, I'm working on getting sharing ready. I have a short little slide presentation with a lot of pictures to show everyone. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. So also the production value isn't as good as Amanda's presentation, but hopefully you'll get the idea. And I also want to say I'm really happy everyone got to hear from Amanda first. So the Illumination Foundation, they do a lot of amazing work in Orange County. There are similar nonprofits in Los Angeles County that are involved in a lot of the projects that we're working on building with city funding. They're really important partners. You heard all about case management. That basically, we fund the actual construction of these projects very often, but there's a whole lot of work on the back end once they're opened to make sure that the operations run smoothly. And as Amanda mentioned, people suffer from homelessness for all different types of reasons. They come in and they need temporary and then permanent placements for mental illness, drug addiction, temporary, you know, in LA, it's an issue where a lot of people have jobs and just can't afford the rent. So for all these different reasons, people come in and they need different services that they can access in order to help them transition to a more permanent place to live. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about one project that the city already has up and running. It's kind of the first of, I think, 15. The goal is to have a tiny home community helping people who are homeless in each of the 15 different council districts in the city. And once we go over that project, I'm also going to highlight a few other things going on in different cities and with different programs where people are focusing on tiny homes. Again, there's so many different reasons people are homeless or become homeless or at risk. There's also so many different types of solution in terms of housing. So tiny home communities, it's something that I know some of you are working on specifically for your spring projects. And just the idea of building small and efficiently, I think might be beneficial for people in your projects, even if you're not focusing on tiny homes. But they're generally, sort of one way of providing shelter, usually not permanent shelter. People can be there for 30 days up to 6 months generally, but the idea is to ultimately place them in a more permanent housing solution. So it's important to know this is just one component of all types of different structures that can be built to help people who are homeless. So very quickly, what is a tiny home? It seems obvious from, it's a small house, but there's actually a specific definition that a lot of people who write the different building codes use, which generally, most people say it means a house of less than 400 square feet. So if you think of like a typical 2-car garage, that's essentially 400 square feet, 20 feet by 20 feet. The average home in California is over 1,600 square feet. And if we're talking about new houses that get built in the US as a whole, those average about 2,500 square feet now. So it's significantly smaller. And the idea is, you can build a tiny home from scratch, but they're often one component of, the larger umbrella term modular homes, which I know people are also looking at for their spring projects. So because they're small and they can sort of be standardized, they're something that can be replicated and delivered on site, generally with one large tractor trailer and potentially assembled that day. So, the tiny house movement, you may have heard of. This is essentially, outside of the area specifically for providing services to the homeless, it's sort of a reaction to the fact that new homes in the US are 2,500 square feet, and a lot of people are looking at ways of downsizing so that their ecological footprint is smaller. Maybe they don't have to go into debt to afford, the typical home. So there's a desire by a lot of people to kind of live more simply. And, some of the ideas coming out of the tiny house movement really can be adopted by cities, and certainly LA is working on it, again, as sort of one component of addressing the homelessness situation, because you can generally get these online pretty quick. They're a lot cheaper than building a full apartment building, so there are a lot of advantages. Speaking of, so some of these we just talked about, but when you're talking about 400 square feet, of course, that's going to be cheaper to build than a traditional apartment unit. Easily replicated again. So you can save time and cost. Let's say, you can come up with one model, one, element of housing that has an arrangement with a bed and a desk and storage in the actual unit. And once you come up with a good design, you can repeat that 10, 20, 50 times. And that helps save on the cost as well. If you sort of can come up with one template that works really well and just duplicate that across one site or different sites. Or sometimes, I think it's important to say, you might have to have a couple different types. Sometimes people with a physical disability won't necessarily find a typical unit for someone without a disability as helpful to them. So you might provide more space for those people, maybe access to storage in areas that they can reach to if they're in a wheelchair. So it doesn't necessarily mean one size fits all. You still want to think about maybe there's a couple options here for how to address the different populations who could be living there. In terms of some ways that this might be a little better of a solution for people, even if we're talking about temporary housing solutions. If you think of a congregant shelter, that first picture Amanda showed of the shelter situation in Orange County, they had a tendency before coronavirus certainly to be somewhat crowded. They're certainly not private spaces, and you can work on designing those to make them more private and more comfortable for people, but there's only so much you can do in that sort of large communal setting. If you're talking about a tiny home, that's instant privacy for people, which anyone can value, even if you're coming from a situation where you're unsheltered. That's something that you can live more comfortably in, at least for a time period, while we try to match you with services and get you into a permanent housing solution. And, LA, all of Southern California, and a lot of the country, we're dealing with the housing emergency that existed before COVID and has gotten worse, which is the economic one. And then with coronavirus, it's important to think about, one of the reasons we're all on screen right now is because we have to physically distance from each other in order to protect ourselves from infection. The homeless population is severely at risk of contracting COVID-19. And so another way that tiny homes can help is, again, providing physical space between you and somebody else on site. And so there's some studies that have been done so far with tiny home communities where they think it has been a pretty effective solution at least minimizing the risk of contracting COVID-19 by going to one of these sort of temporary facilities. So what are some disadvantages? Finding land in Southern California is very difficult. And I know it sort of goes beyond the scope of your program. You all have a site that you've chosen and you're working on designing that. But a lot goes into, in the normal sort of situation, if you're developing an apartment building, finding a site where the zoning and land use is correct. So you don't have to go back to your local city council and seek authority to change that. How do you access a site? Is there a fire hydrant in a specific location and the fire department needs access to a chunk of the site to bring in, their equipment if there's an emergency? Maybe that means you can't place tiny homes or any other physical structure there. So all of these are issues that every development has to deal with, and certainly tiny homes do as well. And when you think of a tiny home, and let's say you're Amanda's employer, and you're actually going to run a community for people to live in, you want to have the ability to house a good chunk of people there so you can adequately provide services to a large group. It doesn't make sense to have maybe one or two tiny homes on a tiny plot of land, but then the Illumination Foundation or another nonprofit has to go to multiple different sites to talk about delivering services to 20 people or more. So finding a size of lot that's big enough, but maybe not too big or not so quite normal in terms of development that other private developers who can pay a good amount of money for that land will be able to snap it up before it can be used for this type of housing solution. A second component where it's a challenge, and I think this is one area where getting student help is really important. Obviously, if you have a small space, you have to be very efficient with how you use that space. Think about what somebody who's homeless might need. We talked about, of course, if you're a dog owner, having space for a dog. There are some shelters that the city is involved in constructing as well that have dog runs and other kennel spaces. So that's one component where dog owners might need to be placed or want to be placed in a certain facility that has those types of amenities. Community space, very important. Making sure there's space for the case management work. All of those things have to be planned into sometimes tight spaces. And this is an example of the specific project I'm going to show all of you in LA, but some of these structures for tiny homes, you can save money in the initial run because maybe you can use lighter materials, or the building codes aren't as stringent if it's a temporary housing solution, but the lifespan of that building might be much shorter. So you have to think about, well, if I invest this much money, I might have this building for roughly 10 years, which is, the pallet shelters in LA, that's generally the lifespan that we're anticipating being used. And also, if you have a tiny home and it's, the typical box with a pitch roof on it, you're basically, kind of restricted to, on the one plane, having this much space on, 100 square feet for one tiny home. And if you're talking about a 5,000 square foot lot, there's only so many tiny homes and therefore so many beds you can place on that land. A more typical building, multifamily apartment building, of course, would have several stories. And so you can naturally have more density in that type of building. And this is, again, an issue for, I think, any building, and certainly for homeless housing, but making sure that there's sufficient community outreach. You don't want to have local homeowners and others in the community publicly opposed to building what you're proposing. Number one, it increases the cost of all of it, and it also increases time in order to get the shelters up and running. So some may say tiny homes might be more easily passed through sort of that community opposition hurdle that a lot of these developments have, as opposed to, a 5-story apartment building. Some people might prefer tiny homes, but it's something to consider. So the first one I want to show you, the first example, and here's luckily where there are some pictures to see. This is actually a pilot program that started in 2017 by the USC Graduate School of Architecture. So essentially, think of it as your spring project, only when you're at the graduate level of architecture school. And I was very impressed by this project and some of the design they had. So I pulled some pictures of the interior spaces. And you can see on the left-hand side, it's a simple box. It looks like a steel frame structure. It's essentially, a rectangle, but they've done interesting things with the layout of shelving. And you can see kind of in this slide on the bottom right, the bed has a backing to it, so you can sort of sit up in bed and use it as a desk area. There's storage. And frankly, it looks stylish. It's a very small space, but it looks beautiful. And it's a way where maybe you can come up with creative ways of, low-cost solutions that are comfortable places for people to live. That would be a really successful tiny home community, whether it's for someone who's homeless or not. And I have to say, some of the examples I'll show you of the city projects, they have thought a lot about design of the community and public spaces. I think we can use a lot of help when we're looking at the insides of these units and how those can be more efficiently designed. So this example of the USC student project, I think, is an example of really good interior design of the spaces that are targeted to what people need if they're living in this tiny home community, and also how to make that work in a very attractive way. The next example is one I'm more familiar with. I think we have some teams in the San Fernando Valley. So for those of you who are familiar, this is the site on Chandler Boulevard, which is right near the North Hollywood Recreation Center. You can actually see in the bottom right, the tiny home community. If you go directly across that street on the right of it, that's Chandler Boulevard. And then you have the North Hollywood Recreation Center. it's this very awkward piece of land, and the city already owned it. And because of that, we were able to very quickly get a tiny home community up and running to serve people again as interim housing for the homeless. And this one has 40 homes, about 75 beds. Each is pretty small, 64 square feet. And when you see some of the pictures on the next slide, you'll see that's very little space, particularly for 2 beds. But they do provide desk areas, air conditioning, ventilation and light, all in that individual unit. And then as a way to save space, what's very common in these types of communities is to have the on-site services and other amenities like shower facilities, dining areas, all of those in separate buildings. So you have a community restroom shower facility, for instance. That saves money. And you can see in the bottom left, there's actually shipping containers, which I think house a lot of the on-site services and the shower areas for the Chandler Boulevard site. So as opposed to having each of those in each of these tiny homes, we can move some of those into communal spaces, and that saves time and money. So here are a couple more views of the Chandler Boulevard site. The notes on the bottom left are more for me, but it's, in thinking about your spring project, ways that you can take what are essentially very cheap buildings. These are manufactured by a company called Pallet, and so we call them in the city pallet shelters. They're cheap and we have a housing emergency, so the idea was let's get these up and running as quickly as possible. But what can we do to make them a little nicer in terms of design? Well, one thing you can do is use colors. So you'll see, without spending a lot of money, you can just paint some of the buildings and the walkways different colors and make it a little more inviting. Orientation, you've talked about that in terms of, earlier sessions you've had with this group when you were programming your spaces, but sometimes it's the site that dictates where you can put these. You'll see there's spaces in between each unit. That's roughly what the LA Fire Department required in terms of spacing to make sure if there is a fire in one building, it wouldn't so quickly spread to another. So there are kind of practical things that may come into mind when you're talking about orientation. But if you look in the bottom right, you can also orient buildings to create sort of a courtyard space, which doubles as a dining area and an outdoor community space. So think about those types of things in your own spring projects designs. And then finally, where to provide services. So again, as Amanda mentioned in her presentation, that's a really important component with any sort of transitional housing, which is another umbrella term we use. So the ultimate goal is for anyone who stays in these tiny home communities to ultimately get placed in a more permanent housing solution. So in order to help that happen and to help with other issues that may be sort of the systemic issue a person has that led to their homelessness, we need to have those case management services. So that's really important. I know it's part of your program requirements, but making sure that the people that were shown in Amanda's slides have access to the services they need and they're on site is really important. And I should say Chandler is the first of, like I said, ultimately 15 different tiny home communities, these pallet shelter communities that the city is working on. So there are a few more opening up in the next couple months. With any construction project, there's some that are on land by other agencies. And so we're working on lease agreements and other things to get those up and running. Chandler is just the first one. Finally, a few more pictures of the interior. I think I started out by saying we can use a lot of design help in the interior spaces if you ask my own opinion. So these are pretty basic, but you can see on the bottom right how someone who's moved into one of these units uses the space. One thing that I know of from my previous work with other homeless shelters and permanent supportive housing developments in the city is making sure there's enough storage for people. So a resident of this community, they may have a pet and they may care very much about having a dog with them. That kind of want is very important. Another thing that a good chunk of people care about is that what little possessions they have, there's a place to store them. And that can be, in the unit itself. There's all kinds of different storage solutions you can come up with. Also, some sort of public storage area for the community is something else to consider. And I know that might be already part of your program requirements. So just a couple more examples, and then I'll get to questions at the end if anyone has them. But San Jose and the Bay Area, they're doing a similar project right now. They have one that opened last year, which was 40 tiny homes. They're a little bit larger, and you can see they played around a little bit more with the volumes of space above. So you can see how the roof line slants, and that allows a window that you can see on the left-hand side to provide a little more light and ventilation to the unit. It's a similar idea though. They have shared laundry facilities, bathrooms, kitchens, a computer lab, other meeting rooms, a lounge area. And again, this is one that has that dog park and a dog run for residents. Again, on the right side, you can see some in the interior pictures, and I'm sorry, the quality is not so great. But I think there can be a lot of work again and using this space more efficiently. So this is what they've done sort of as an emergency solution, but to the extent we can get help from anyone in designing these more efficiently, they'll be more effective in providing services to residents who move in. My final example is, I call it Puget Sound. There's been an effort over the last few years all over the Seattle area, so that includes Tacoma and Olympia, Washington, other cities in that area, to build tiny home communities to deal with their homelessness crisis. And so the Low Income Housing Institute, it's sort of another Illumination Foundation type nonprofit that works in the Seattle area. They have 400 tiny homes that they're currently operating in 12 separate villages and servicing about 1,000 people annually. So, this is another example of different types of housing units that could be built to serve the community. Again, it's important to pair it with on-site services. But, they could be simple shelters like this, but you'll see in the slide or the picture on the right, some people have sort of customized their living areas who are maybe staying longer than 30 days, using different color again, painting murals on the wall, sort of anything to make it more homey in a way that's, not going to cost a lot of money. Just a couple more pictures of some of the Seattle tiny home communities. You can see again on the right-hand side how somebody has set up their own unit. They have a little more artwork on the walls, different paint colors. And I talked in the beginning about COVID-19. So the Seattle example, because it's been up and running for a few years now, they have some good data to sort of support that when you're comparing the tiny home communities in that area to temporary shelter facilities where there's not as much space between people, that COVID-19 rates have been significantly lower. So on top of the housing crisis, again, to protect people from illness and specifically in the pandemic, these might be an effective solution. So I think that's it for my presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Michael. We did have a few questions from Mark. One is, what's your take on two-story tiny houses? Are there any currently in plan or at the moment?
So in the city of LA, the program that I'm more familiar with, it's sort of, we need to house people immediately because of COVID-19. So there hasn't been as much focus on how to make 2-story tiny homes or sort of stack different tiny homes together and what might look more like a normal apartment building. However, that slide of the USC student work, that structure, those rectangular structures, they actually did create them so they could be stackable. And I didn't have a good picture of that, unfortunately, but I think they designed it in AutoCAD and used some rendering software so that they could at least be 3 stories tall. So it's definitely possible and something to think about. These are pretty simple examples. You know, I would say the taller you go and the more kind of stackable you get, it might increase the price slightly in terms of the structure, but that might also help deal with the land issue, right? If you can increase the density on a small site, the land is really what's going to be expensive in a lot of these developments. So it's a good thing to think about.
Thanks, Michael. And I just want to double check. I know we're probably running short on time.
We can do one more question.
Okay. Let's see, I'm gonna pull one out randomly here. Cynthia from El Rancho asked, do you think universal design for wheelchair is best, or sounds like maybe have different options, so you have wheelchair accessible homes and maybe smaller versions to maximize number of people you could accommodate?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I do think, and you know, this is more on the legal side, so I have some more familiarity with requirements that the Americans with Disabilities Act and the California equivalent accessibility laws, they do require, there's a whole building code dealing with making sure there's adequate clearance for people if they're turning a wheelchair, or that they can get through a doorway and not, you know, hit their knuckles on the side of the door jamb as they're, you know, going through, or making sure lower cabinets in a kitchen, you can pull a wheelchair up underneath. So there are a lot of important things that I think might require more space for somebody who has a physical disability. And whether it's 120 square feet or, you know, the smaller size, hard to say. But I do think, you know, the more space you have to work with when you're talking about a unit for someone with a physical disability, that makes it more likely you're going to meet all of the stringent requirements.
Thanks, Michael.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Michael, for your insight into the various tiny home projects and tying them into our spring project. We greatly appreciate you both taking time to speak with us today about this important issue. I know I learned a lot, so I can imagine that everyone else did as well. Before we leave for the day, I do just have a couple of announcements. If you would like to attend our Spotlight on ACE program starting in just a little bit at 5 o'clock, please copy the link in the chat box and log in at 5 o'clock. We have HGTV's Flipper Flop star, Tariq El Moussa, speaking about the road that led to his success, which includes many mentors along the way. We will also hear from some ACE students who are now in college and participating in our ACE internship program. It is sure to be a fun event, so we hope you're able to join us. For our seniors, this is just your reminder that the ACE scholarship application deadline is April 15th. If you have not yet started your application, please do not wait. The process does take some time, and you will need to collect recommendation letters and your transcript. So please log into acementor.org to start or to complete your application. We've only got a couple short weeks and it will go fast. Summer camp, all of you students received an email regarding the USC architecture and the EPIC Cal Poly San Luis Obispo engineering camps this summer. There are limited spots. If you are interested and can commit to attending either of these camps, I need to hear from you no later than tomorrow. Our next student session is next week on April 1st. It's a new added spring project session. So if you haven't yet registered, the link is also in the chat box. So that is all from me. Kent, do you have anything to add?
Nope.
All right, then I'm going to thank Amanda and Michael again for your excellent presentations, and to all of you for attending, and hopefully we will see you all next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you.